Welcome back to Detailed, an original podcast by RCAT. This is a show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Cherise Lakeside, Senior Spec Writer at RDH Building Science, and your host. My guest today is Stacie Wong, Principal at GLUCK Plus in New York. Stacie joined GLUCK Plus in 2001 as an Associate Principal. She brings considerable design and construction experience in both educational and residential projects. Notable educational projects include the award-winning Pilkey Lab, ground-up science research building for Duke University Marine Lab on their coastal campus, and the award-winning East Harlem School, both utilizing architect-led design build. Among other projects, she has extensive experience with school feasibility and programming studies at both K-12 and university levels. The project we will be chatting about today is the Sinderen Plaza Project in Brooklyn. Sinderen Plaza is a model of transportation and opportunity in Brooklyn, serving a neighborhood where the need for affordable housing is urgent. Located on the border between East New York and Brownsville, where over half the residents live below the poverty line, the development turns long-abandoned land into a vibrant community asset. The project incorporates green building practices, featuring a ventilated rain screen system on the facade, built from fiber cement panels, and using fully recyclable, mostly natural materials. Now let's get into the details. Welcome back to Detailed. My guest today is Stacie Wong, Principal at tell me if I don't say this right, GLUCK Plus in New York. New York, lovely city. Someday I'm getting back there. The project we're talking about today is the Sinderen Plaza Project in Brooklyn. Stacie, welcome to Detailed. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
I appreciate you taking time out of what I'm sure is your busy day to join me today. We'll get right down to business. I like to start with an icebreaker question. Everybody gets a different question. I have fun picking these sometimes. So my question for you today is, what do you feel has been the most memorable moment in your career?
I would say, and I have said this to a lot of people, one of the things that GLUCK Plus is known for is architect-led design build, which I know we'll talk a little bit about much later on. But it's when here we do the practice where on many of our projects, not all, but many of our projects, we are both the architects as well as the builders or the construction managers on the project. And whereas, there are a lot of firms that if they do this, they have a separate architecture arm and a separate construction arm. And one of the things that we do here is that it's all the same people. And the big reason for that is that we feel like the more you know about construction and how things get together and the conditions on a construction site, the better and more strategic designer you are. And when you're out on the construction site and you know what's really important to the client and you know what's in the drawings, you're better able to problem solve some things that come up. But, when people come into the office, obviously, most of us do not have experience with design build, especially the build part. And so for me, I think the most memorable aspect of my career was the very first time that I did design build, which was on a school in East Harlem back in 2000 and started 2006, finished in 2008. And it was a huge eye-opener and, terrified a little bit when you first start being an architect out there, not really having that much construction experience under my belt and just really embracing the process and say, look, we just have to see where this road takes me. And I learned incredible amounts of information, and it really grew me as an architect and as a person, I think. So I think that for me was very memorable and shaped the trajectory of my entire career.
I'm about to go down my this might be a record, my first rabbit hole.
Uh,
So I stray from the questions, and feel free to say, I don't want to answer that. If you don't want to, but on that first project
mhm.
that you did, what was it like being a woman on the construction site out there running the show? Did it work? I know things are getting better on construction sites, but I know that we're not perfect yet. Just out of curiosity, like, did you have to work harder to do what you needed to do?
I would say, um, I mean, I work hard anyway, and I think architects in general work hard. So I think that that was never an issue. I think it was more, um, it was more. Let me see if I can figure out how to phrase this. Uh, I think any architect who goes out there and is trying to be a construction manager, I think, on a construction site, many people have some skepticism about architects, or they think architects are going to be unreasonable, or architects are going to demand certain things and not necessarily know how things get put together. And I think for me, it was understanding that everybody has a certain point of view in terms of, what trade that they do. And I know that being out there, I'm not going to be an expert at plumbing. I'm not going to be an expert at, electrical. I'm not going to be an expert at carpentry. But one of the things I know really well are what's in the drawings and what's in the specifications, and even thinking ahead, something that we're doing now very early on in construction, it's going to have implications 6 months from now, a year from now, because I know what the ultimate design detail is going to be. I think for a lot of people that are in construction, purely construction, I don't think they're ever going to know the drawings as well as the architect, and they're never going to know what's most important to the client. So, in a funny way, I almost came to the job site with a leg up. I already knew what was in there, and it was more about communication and just being open to if somebody had an issue with the way something was shown in the drawings, just trying to say, well, you know, what's your issue? Why do you think that that's a problem? And being open about it rather than being defensive. And I think that maybe early on, there maybe was some skepticism because I was a woman out on the construction site, but I think that pretty much goes away pretty quickly when they recognize that um, there are certain things that I know that are, which is the drawings. There's certain things that they know, which is their specific trade, and really it's just about communication and kind of finding the best way forward. So I, uh, it I think, what people would normally think as it being maybe, a disadvantage to being a woman on the site, I think, it stopped being an issue, I would say maybe a month, 2 months into the project.
I love hearing that. I've been around a while, so I've seen a lot over the course of my career. But I've also heard a trend just from my guests. Architects historically have had a bit of a bit of a reputation about their egos, and their vision is the only vision. And um, that ceiling's being crashed as well. And I'm seeing more or less and less of that, less evidence of that, and much more collaboration and open communication and a higher level of emotional intelligence. And the building doesn't happen without everybody on that team. It just doesn't.
That's right.
And so working together is key. I just had to ask about that. Thank you. That was a great life lesson as well. Listeners, pay attention. Let's talk about this project.
Okay.
So before we get started on the building and design details, I noticed this project was developed under, I got to read this, New York City's Department of Housing Preservation and Development's Extremely Low and Low Income Affordability Program.
Mhm.
Big long name.
Big
And
long name.
yeah. And
They
else,
shorten it by Ella. They say it's the Ella program.
oh, okay. I'll remember that. It also appears there were several other agencies involved. I know housing is really expensive in New York. Tell me what this program's all about.
So HPD, as you said, it's a Department of Housing Preservation and Development, and they are, I think, one of the largest municipal developers of affordable housing in the nation. And it makes sense because it's New York City. There's a lot of people here, so affordable housing is a big thing, and developing housing in a very dense environment like that takes a lot of different a lot of different parties, whether it's developers, where the financiers, the people that are trying to figure out how to fund these projects. And the ELLA program is, so HPD has several different programs depending on what kind of housing is being developed. They have programs for supportive housing. They have programs for senior housing. They have programs they call like mix and match, which is a mix of affordable housing as both low income as well as moderate housing. But the ELLA program is very specific to a certain income band in the city, and it's specifically for new construction financing. So I'll get maybe talk a little bit about affordable housing, and because everybody always asks the question, well, when you talk about affordable housing, it's affordable for who? So what HUD basically sets what we call the area median income, or AMI, for various cities throughout the United States. And New York City, for example, in 2019, when this project was basically sending out applications for people to apply to rent here, AMI for New York City was $106,700 for a family of four. And so that basically equals what we say 100% AMI. So for the ELLA program, the developers who are doing the housing, they basically have to propose a number of units and what percentage of AMI they're going to provide in the building. And in the case of Van Sinderen, 100% of the units were for households earning between 27 and 57% AMI. So
Wow.
I actually have the advertising sheet that they sent out when they were um, doing the rents and figuring out the rents and asking people to apply for one of the apartments. And so let's say for the 27% AMI unit, a family of four um, had to make, in order to qualify, maximum of $31,290 annually for a family of four.
Wow.
And a family who was making that maximum, their rent for a two-bedroom apartment in this building would have been $502 a month in New York City. And so I'll just keep going. So then up to the next income band, which was 37% AMI, that family of four, the maximum they could make was $41,720. And that family could rent a two-bedroom apartment for $706 a month. And then I'll just keep going. So then we have the 47% AMI. So maximum family of four income would be around $52,000, and they could get a two bedroom for $910 and a three bedroom for $1,045 a month. And then the highest income band that could be in this building was 57% AMI, and that for a family of four was $62,580 annual salary, and they could get a two-bedroom apartment for $1,114 and a three-bedroom for $1,281. So that kind of gives you a sense of what the ELLA program is about. It's really for about the extremely low and low income affordability band for people in New York City. And I kind of recently had looked up, well, when people say, how many people in New York City are of these different income bands. And when I looked from 0 to 60% AMI, it's about 48% of New Yorkers, New York City people who this building could serve, which is, when you think about that, that's pretty astronomically, that's an astronomical number.
Yeah, when you first just said whatever the number was, 106,000 AMI, correct?
Mm-hmm.
The original number for a family of four, I thought in New York. That's not very much money. And then you went into these different income bands. So it's truly really helping people get a place to live that are not going to. I don't know how anybody in some of those income bands could survive in New York, period.
Well, and I
They
think,
couldn't here. I'm
I
on
mean,
the
I think
West Coast in Portland, and they could not get rents are high here, not like New York, but they're high. They couldn't find anything more than a rundown shack if they're lucky here in those income groups.
and I would say that, these different programs, like I said, HPD has a bunch of different programs, and the Ella program is very specific to like certain developers. That's what they excel at. They know how to deliver housing that is affordable through the Ella program. But there's a whole spectrum of people in New York City that maybe aren't that low income. They're more middle, moderate income, and housing is still unaffordable to them. And so HPD actually has a bunch of different programs that different developers um, can apply for and figure out funding for in order to meet like different income bands. So here, like I think that there are affordable housing programs that are 140% AMI or 160% AMI, and that's still considered very like affordable housing here in New York City, but it's just reaching different demographics in the city, because I think that's really important also.
So I got to have somebody in the city of Portland call somebody in the city of New York. There's a lot of people in this city struggling. So I'm curious what the programming phase of this project looked like with so many players in the game. How did that all work to you know, get where you needed to go to start working on this building?
So I would say the major person that kind of develops at least the starting point of where the program is the primary developer on the project. And so I will say I'm going to tie my the initial question you asked about, which was like a pivotal part in my career, which was this school in East Harlem, the East Harlem School, where I did design build, and it, got a lot of press. It was in a lot of different magazines, both because of the design build aspect of it, but purely just because of the design. And one day, this dynamic, developer, her name is Rella Foliano, called up and said, "I'd like to talk to you guys about doing some affordable housing." So, we set up a meeting. She came in, and we had never done affordable housing before that. And she came in because she said, I found an article online about your East Harlem school where you really pushed the design, but were very conscious of uh, the budget that had to be met. And she says, I want to be able to do a beautiful, affordable housing project, something that is different than what you see throughout the city. But obviously, it needs to be affordable, and you guys are the ones to do it. And that came from, a completely different building type that, but it was, it for me, it's always interesting, like, you never know where your next project's gonna come from. I think affordable housing was something that we, as an office, always wanted to do, but you never know how you're gonna kinda break into a new building type, who's gonna give you a chance at it if you've not done it before. And, so, Ralph Foliano came in and basically, "We really McQuestion Companies, we really wanna work with you to try to do affordable housing." And we said, "Look, we've never done it before." And she goes, "That's not a problem." She goes, "I've done a ton of them. We're going to work together and try to do something spectacular." And so for her, because she had all of this experience with affordable housing, that was kind of the starting point, which, is she is very familiar with the Ella program. She knows like what number and mix of units really work for her performa. And so that's kind of the starting point. But then you have to bring in different people. So she had two partners. She was the primary developer, but she had two partners. One was Best Development, and Ron Schulman from Best Development is great. And he really has in depth, detailed knowledge about how you set up a financial deal with affordable housing, both for uh, how you figure out all the tax credits, how you figure out bonds for it? How do you figure out construction financing for low income housing? So he was the partner that really worked through the numbers and then helped refine how many units and what percentage were 1, 2, 3 bedrooms. And in this case, we didn't have any studios and we didn't have any 4 bedrooms. And then I think the final partner in this was a local somebody who knew that specific area in Brooklyn really well, and it was the local development corporation of East New York, because this was in the East New York neighborhood of Brooklyn. And, their expertise obviously was, they have boots on the ground. They know what the community really wants and desires. And they also know and are tied into a lot of the local businesses and some of the local subcontractors who are looking for construction work and are looking for maybe us specifying certain materials, local materials that could be used in the building. So between the three of them, I think, that's kind of what helped formulate what the program would be. But then there's, other things that come into play. So HPD, since, their big thing is um, through these programs developing affordable housing, they want to make sure that it's quality housing. They just don't want to say, have any developer who's interested in doing it um, kind of at carte blanche to do anything they want. HPD actually has very specific design guidelines for minimum and maximum sizes of apartments, minimum sizes of living rooms, of bedrooms, minimum, linear footage of shelving and closet rod space. They want to make sure that if housing's going to be delivered, there is a base standard that every single HPD project has to follow. And, in a strange way, we do also a lot of market rate housing here in the city. And for these affordable housing projects, some of, I would say for a lot of our bedrooms and living rooms for some of these affordable housing projects are actually larger than the market rate because HPD really wants to make sure that it's quality apartments. So I think that's a big part of the programming component. And I think another part of it has to do with New York City zoning, which dictates a lot of what you develop here. And I would say that um, New York City zoning was a big part of that programming process. And maybe I'll go through a little bit of it. So, site selection in New York City is a little interesting. Everybody always says, how do you find vacant land? And there often is a lot of vacant land in the city, but it's not necessarily straightforward to develop for housing. And so in this case, um, the site that these projects were on were actually zoned for manufacturing. And here it's called M11 district. They have a bunch of different districts. And in order to build housing here, we had to go through a rezoning process to rezone it for residential use. And and as part of that rezoning, we had to work with city planning in order to figure out, what they were going to let us rezone it for. And so I have some basic numbers, but so M11 for our two combined lots, and I think we can get into the siding, but M11 allows just like what we call FAR of one. So if our lot size is 37,500 square feet, they let you build 31,500 square feet. And so when we were trying to figure out, okay, well, that's not enough for housing, obviously. And so we were looking to work with HPD and city planning to go for an R6 rezoning, which has an FAR of 2.43. So instead of designing 37,000 square foot building, you could design a 91,000 square foot building. And then as we were talking to city planning more, and this was at the time when Mayor de Blasio was New York City's mayor, and his big mandate was for affordable housing, city planning ended up coming back and saying, actually, we want you to upzone it a little bit more. Can we do it R7A? And that allowed us to design up to 150,000 square feet. So we went from a site that was really only as of right allowed for 37,000 and went all the way up to 150,000 square feet, which that's obviously a huge part of the program. It lets you know how much you can actually build on the site. So that's
Wow.
probably a lot of detail and a lot of
Wow.
numbers, but I like
No,
to try to make things tangible so that people
no,
understand, like,
that's
what it means.
that's exactly what I'm looking for though, because one of the things I love about this podcast is giving people ideas of different ways to approach things. I mean, we all know in this business that really our job is to problem solve all day, every day to get to where we need to go. And you get stumped sometimes, but it really helps having a, in this case, having city agencies and departments that are all behind getting this done. They're not fighting you to do that. And you triggered another question I'll have coming up soon. I got all kinds of rabbit holes. We're going to be here till March. So let's start digging into more specifics. Let's first start with a broad description of this project, just a general broad description of the project.
Okay. So, it's new construction, and the project comprised of two brand new buildings, each of them 7 stories. So the total gross square footage of the two projects combined was about 194,000 square feet. And so you'll ask, well, how are you able to build 194,000 when our rezoning allowed 150,000? But we can get into that. Um, these two buildings combined had 130 affordable housing units from second to the seventh floor. And then on the ground floor, it was retail and community facility. The project is located in, as I said, the East New York neighborhood of Brooklyn, probably one of the fastest growing sections of Brooklyn, where over half the population lives below the poverty line, hence the desperate need for housing like this. And the project was built on land that had been vacant for decades because it was a manufacturing lot, and it's actually a pretty complicated lot because it's right up against the elevated subway train. It's just a difficult site to build on. And in order to pull the deal off, it was formerly 9 individual lots that had to be combined in order to make these two projects. So, and I think you're probably gonna show maybe images of the project, but, it is 2 buildings, and each of the buildings were very different sizes. So one is kind of like a smaller kinda square building, 28,000 square feet, and then, the larger building was across the street. So they have 2 very different scales, but one of the things that we wanted to make sure of is that they still felt like one project. And, that kind of inspired a little bit of the design of it to have it feel like it was a gateway into East New York, but, I think those are the basics of the project.
You just mentioned that there were 9 separate lots that were consolidated through public and private partnership to develop these 2 buildings. And this was the question that was triggering, or this was the question I was waiting to get to that was triggering another question in my head. So you said also that it was zoned previously industrial.
Mhm.
And I've done some projects or done some interviews on some other projects where they were building something on a site that previously had been industrial, and they had issues oftentimes with contaminated ground and things like that. So I'm curious, what challenges, if any, did you face with these sites? And how did that site influence the actual design of the building
Okay.
or those sites?
Alright, so yeah, there's a lot of sub-questions in that, so
Yeah.
we'll try to break it down. So, I think in New York City, site selection is, it drives everything about how something is designed, and sometimes there are just some lots that, don't seem viable to develop on, or you could develop on it, but they're just a little too small, so maybe the economies of scale aren't there. So the as I said, there were 2 buildings across or 2 sites across the street from each other. One of them, which is the smaller site, and that one actually was comprised of 9 lots. They were small lots, but they were 9 lots in that one small square site, and that site was actually all of those lots were owned by the city. And then across the street, an equally an equal size lot was, also owned by the city. It was 1 lot, so it almost felt like it was, maybe previously the 9 lots similar to across the street, but it was still pretty small, and that was city-owned. So I think if the city decided that they wanted to try to have a private developer develop those 2 sites, I think it would have been difficult because, they're pretty small and, and if you were to say, "Okay, I want you to build 2 buildings," you're basically asking a developer to try to develop 2 smaller buildings, which has a lot of complications. In New York City, even though it'd be considered one project, each one is considered by building department 2 completely separate buildings, has 2 separate filings. It's very labor intensive. It was Best Development, Ron Schulman, who, actually tried to put this deal together. He actually knew that next to, um, the city-owned site, there were 2 lots that were privately owned, vacant, but, probably wasn't so developable because it was on a pretty narrow street, didn't really have, presence on the major intersection in that neighborhood, and it was manufacturing. So it also would not necessarily have been a site that somebody would say, "You know what, I wanna develop housing here." But it was the foresight of Ron who basically said, "I think we can piece these lots together. I'm gonna approach the city and say, we have these privately owned lots, and if we could somehow combine them with all of the city-owned lots and make it one large project, we actually think we can make something viable here for housing." And so that's kind of where it started. I mean, sometimes the city has city-owned land. They send out RFPs and basically invite developers to propose something on those sites. And I think in this case, it was a private developer who identified this opportunity and actually was the one who approached the city with it to try to put together this deal. And so I think that was something that was pretty proactive and very astute of Best Development to kind of identify this opportunity. But the site actually it was a little difficult. As I said, it's fronting the elevated, train, but not only is it, facing the train station and the elevated train tracks, the street itself was really, really narrow. The street was only 26 feet wide, so it was a one-way street, 26 feet wide, and the sidewalk was only 5 feet wide. So if you can imagine trying to um develop housing and actually do construction on housing and then finally have somebody live on a site where you're so close to the train tracks. There's some, um, it doesn't naturally lend itself to saying, "Oh, yeah, that's where we're gonna develop, 130 units of affordable housing." But what that site condition drove us to do is said, "We have to give some of our site back to the public realm. We need to have a wider sidewalk. We need to make it feel like it's safer." So the entire first floor of the building set back 10 feet so that we could actually have a 15-foot sidewalk, put street trees, and actually make it feel like it was, a safe, sidewalk that people could commute down and walk by, go between their home and then actually go to, the subway station that is right there at that intersection. But because that site was, slightly, narrow, in order for us to have enough, I guess, room or dimension to basically do, uh, apartments, viable apartments. We then had to somewhat cantilever the building back over the sidewalk from 2nd to the 7th floor so that we had, sufficient depth in order to develop apartments, and maximize the number of apartments on that site. So, there were there were constraints on this site that really drove what the design of the building ultimately became.
And I had read that, and that was exactly the answer I was hoping you would give me, is explaining how that worked with the design of the building and the sidewalks and why you ended up there. Because I was just fascinated by that because it really looked like, to me, from my digging around looked like it would have been a very hard project to achieve and be somewhere that somebody would be proud to come home to, which is a big deal. I mean, having a home that you feel safe and comfortable in lifts everybody up. Um,
Absolutely.
no, I love that. It was a perfect answer. Uh, Before we move on to the next question, was there, being previously industrial, was there any problems with the ground at all? Any ground contamination or anything like that you had to deal with?
So there wasn't ground contamination, but I think because the site was vacant for so long, it probably was. People felt it was a little bit like a dumping ground. So what was there was, as they started to do some excavation. I mean, they did borings and everything as part of the geotech due diligence and things like that. Didn't find anything, but then the problem with borings is, like, you're basically, sticking toothpicks in cake, finding the done parts and the undone parts, and there may be an undone part right next to where you poked your toothpick in and you missed it, and that's kind of what happened. When they started excavation, they found, like, uh, had to be hundreds of tires, old tires that somebody had just dumped onto the site. So they did have to pause for a period during excavation to try to get rid of a lot of the trash that they ended up finding hidden underground. But there weren't major contamination issues with the site, although we did do, a vapor barrier, um, a higher end vapor barrier in order to make sure that there was, if there was anything in the soil, that it would not transfer up through the building.
Wow, I hear all kinds of things about finding, somebody. I worked on a project once. It was an empty site for decades, but it had been a dry cleaning business that had been there for years and years, and they had dumped all their chemicals in the ground, and they had to dig down like 12 feet, remove like 12 feet of dirt, and replace it, and it's always chemicals I hear about. I was not prepared for tires and garbage, but I mean, makes sense. Um, so you've given me a broad description of the buildings themselves. Tell me a little bit about what's included in these buildings. What if I walked in, just again broadly, because we'll get into more specifics, what would I find inside the building?
Well, I think uh, one of the things as we're organizing the building is, a lot of times ground floor apartments aren't really desirable. I mean, they're not great for the families that live in them. When you have, I mean, New York City is a very dense city, and to have somebody like walking along the sidewalk right by your windows, it means you always have your curtains drawn. So I think one of the things uh, that was definitely the plan here, was to say, okay, the ground floor, we're going to try to do retail or some sort of community facility, and actually make that a little bit more public, especially since we were on this major intersection that was right next to one of the subway stations. It would be this great thing as people you know, um, come home after the end of a work day, that there are actually, services there that they can use before they walk home. So that was kind of a good pairing, basically having that retail community facility on the first floor. And then for the apartments, um, it was really trying to maximize the number of units that we could do, but then also trying to provide the amenities that would work for a building like this. So each one of the buildings had its own indoor resident recreation room. Each one of the buildings had its own laundry room that everybody in the building could use. Each one had an outdoor roof deck that, on a nice day, they could go out and hang out together on. And, um, and I think that's, the basic program of the building, other than, having it being an elevator building, making sure that there's, trash and recycling rooms and chutes on every single floor. That's very New York City. You're not bringing your own trash down to the trash cans on the street, and things like that.
I had missed the roof decks, and that's not typically something that you see in affordable housing. And I know, again, New York's a very dense city, and having any kind of outdoor space, recreational space in a lot of neighborhoods is really valued. I'm sure that the tenants in that building love that they have that.
I think, yeah, the outdoor deck, is absolutely an amenity. I mean, just to be able to have, some outdoor space where it's not on, the street or you don't have to walk to if you have, kids or a dog and you just wanna be able to quickly go out, get some fresh air, and then go back home. I mean, it's definitely an amenity, and each one of the buildings, that because of its configuration, it's organized a little differently, but, our goal was to have the indoor rec room and the laundry room in proximity, and adjacent to that outdoor roof deck so that somebody could say, I'm going to throw a load of laundry in. I'm going to go sit outside, read a paper or just enjoy the sunshine while I'm waiting for my clothes to dry. So I think for us, it was trying to incorporate amenities, but have those strong adjacencies that help support one another. And then also it was a place where everybody could, if everybody in the building, this is like the one floor where, it's the shared public space, you get to know your neighbors.
Let's get into some details on the exterior design of this building. Working for an enclosure consultant, I'm always extra interested in that anyway.
Okay.
You did some interesting things with your design and building massing to accommodate the things like the wider sidewalks and gaining the larger building footprint, among other things. Tell me about this exterior design and the motivations behind your decisions there.
So the exterior, as I said earlier, the street is pretty narrow. And so you're very rarely going to experience a building just frontally. Everything always is going to, you're walking down a narrow street and you're almost experiencing the building on the oblique. And so one of the thing, and it was probably less of an issue on the smaller building, but certainly for the longer building, which was over 200 feet long, we felt like you had to break down the scale. And so one of the things we thought is a great way of doing that is to kind of create a gradation of pattern and color on that facade so that as you're walking down the street, it's kind of like almost like a marker of where you are. It just doesn't feel like one big um, expanse of sameness. And so that was one of the things we did. We tried to, incorporate multiple colors of panels on the facade in order to do that. Um, One of the interesting things about this project also is that you actually experience the building from the subway platform level, and we felt like, the for the building to basically act as almost like a colorful backdrop or an active backdrop to be, part of that neighborhood. That was something that we thought was very intriguing, and so we also felt like, by doing that pattern and that gradation, it also helped the building kind of participate in the life of the people who that's their subway station, and when they get home, they're like, "Oh, this is our stop," because it's actually interesting if you ride the subway and, as, we go to the subway or we go to the site, once a week for, just our site visits, and as the facade panels started to go up, it was actually this amazing thing, like, the subway car would come driving and you kinda see the building almost like a film strip. It felt really animated, and we got very excited that, something that we envisioned in our head, it actually was even more powerful and interesting, um, in real life than what the rendering was showing, and a huge part of that is because the movement of the subway. But in terms of, well, people say, "Well, what kind of material was it?" So it's a concrete board, a color concrete board that's done by Swiss Pearl, and I have a bunch of, the different samples, for those who are watching on YouTube. But it's a pretty broad color sample, and one of the things that people say is for affordable housing, how do you do this? How do you do something that may be a little different? And so one of the things that, and this was something that came from us, um, seeing how things get put up on the building, in construction. For us, we knew that a big part of material cost is waste. And so we said, okay, well, we're going to design this building to minimize waste. So for Swiss Pearl, they had their basic um, panel size is 4 foot by 10 foot. And we said that's perfect for affordable housing. The standard, floor to floor height in general is around 9 foot 4 inches. And, for us, we learned a lot about affordable housing and, well, where does the 9 foot 4 inches come from? And a big part of that is, a lot of traditional affordable housing was always done load bearing construction with CMU, and then concrete, precast concrete plank. And CMU is an 8-inch module. Concrete plank thickness for those kind of spans is an 8-inch module. So floor to floor heights were always based on an 8-inch module. So that's where the 9 foot 4 comes from. And we said, well, if we made the facade out of a pattern of 9 foot 4, so going floor to floor, and doing two different widths of panel, one 2 foot 8, one 1 foot 4, you're basically almost have zero waste on the panels that we're using. So that was one of the ways that we kinda derive the patterning of the project. And then in terms of the colors, we said, well, we know we're not gonna be asking for custom colors, but these buildings are really large. So I think of the 7 colors that we had on there, 5 of them were standard colors. And to kind of make that pattern, we said, well, Swiss Pearl, do you think you can do, 2 custom colors at, no additional cost because, we're predominantly using standard colors, and that was something that they were willing to do, and they did a couple different color tests so we could find what was the right, gradation of color to kinda get that pattern on there.
That's a, that's interesting, and I'm glad to hear that, a manufacturer stepped up and said, "Yeah, we can work that deal, and we can make this happen the way that you want it to happen." Because
That's
at
right.
the end of the day, it's helping people as well. So that's a feather in their cap.
And then I'm also gonna talk a little bit about the facade from the part that people don't see, and since you're really interested in, exterior envelopes, you're probably familiar with this product, but, one of the things also during construction is you're for construction costs, you're trying to, reduce, schedule. And, in this case, we were doing it was, exterior stud wall construction. And, the normal thing that you often see, this was a rain screen system. What you normally see is you have, your Dens glass sheathing, and then you put your building wrap, and then you, put your continuous insulation. So it would be mineral wool or something like that. And then you start putting your girts and your or actually, you put your girts first, then you put your mineral wool, then you start putting on your panels. But for a building especially for the large one that was 214 feet long, that's a lot of different times that people have to come and make that sweep across the building. So we ended up during our R&D period coming across this product that it was by Dow, but Dow got bought out by DuPont. So it's DuPont's uh, Cavity Mate Ultra product, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I have a sample right here, which is super lightweight. And for us, it was this amazing thing when we started talking to Dow DuPont. They said, well, this basically takes the place of all of those layers. So instead of having to do your Dens glass and instead of having to do your building wrap and then your insulation, this basically goes directly against your stud wall. And then, obviously you're sealing the joints, but that basically is one pass at the building and it's super lightweight. So it's not heavy stuff that you're trying to position in a place and get people to, do construction in the middle of winter when it's super cold. And then once this is up, automatically you can start putting up your girts in your exterior cladding. And for us, that was actually, it was the first time I'd used this system and I was fascinated by it. And that, that one also, the rep from Dow, he was great to try to figure out how to work out these details and give the developer a comfort level that even though it was something that they hadn't done before and wasn't being done that much in New York City, they kind of helped us through the details and helped us through the testing and the engineer judgments and things like that to make sure that we could do that. And that was a huge time saver.
I imagine that saved a fortune.
Yes,
And so
absolutely,
far
absolutely.
it's working the way that you wanted it to work.
It's working and it's great. It's really it's continuous installation. So, now with sustainability is such a big thing and having, good thermal performance on your walls. This basically is I mean it gives you a really strong high thermal value exterior wall with little effort.
Well, DuPont's gonna love you for this. I can make sure I tag them in it. They can take you to lunch or something. Um, but I believe in that. I believe in celebrating and sharing the things that work because I think that helps all of us
Well, and,
in
and
exploring new. Because those types of products are relatively new on the market compared to how we've always done things. I went to um, a big lifetime fitness project they're building out here, ginormous facility, to look at a similar type of project being put up. And I actually called the contractor and said, I want to come out and see it. And I'm sorry, I can't think of the name of the product right now, but I wanted to see it going up because I'm like having a hard time. And this was a while back, you know, seeing this thing is going to replace multiple layers of the building. It's like, you're going to need to prove it. Let me see it. But
what and
huge
this one
time and cost saver.
huge time and cost saver. And so some of the things that we were curious about is compressive strength. So obviously that's the thing that your girts are going to be up against, and we're like, well, how do we know that that's going to is the compressive strength sufficient so that if you're, putting your girts on the wall, is it going to depress and then create an issue um, for the construction of that girt system and the cladding? And they showed all the testing saying it had that sufficient, even though it's lightweight and it's insulation, it had high compressive strength so that that was not an issue. And then for the architects out there who, when you're doing a rain screen system, everybody's saying, well, what happens at the open joint in a rain screen? And for a lot of these products, when I think this product initially was put to market, it's the color that a lot of board insulation is. It's that light blue. And you're like, okay, we have that light blue, but you can't, we have to cover that light blue if you're doing an open joint rain screen. So that means you have to do extra effort by putting, let's say, like some sort of, black strips or something to cover the joint. But then they came up with the product where they made it a dark gray instead of the blue, so that once you put your cladding on, that dark gray basically looks black and disappears. And so, they had to develop their product also if they really wanted people to use it and not have to do like a building wrap or anything like that. They had to have something that allowed you to do an open joint and not see their product behind it.
Interesting. I'll be sending some notes out to people after this episode. Um, are there any other exterior products you'd like to highlight on the outside of the building?
I would say for the exterior, one of the things that people ask is, well, what is it like to live so in such close proximity to the train? Am I going to be staying up all night because I'm hearing the train rumbling by? And so acoustic performance was actually really important. And for any of these projects that are, especially projects that have city land that they're working on, an EAS is required in order to analyze what are the different things on a site that need to be addressed. And so sound was definitely one of them. And the engineer who put together the EAS, they did evaluate the what acoustic performance we had to have for that exterior wall to mitigate for that sound. And I learned a lot about it. But interestingly, even though there's a lot of sound by being just in proximity to the where the subway is coming, where the train is coming in and stopping at the subway platform, strangely, where most of the noise was emanating from is if you kind of looked a little further away from our site, the tracks actually make this turn before it comes into our station. And it's the train where it screeches a little bit when it hits that turn, which actually was the bigger driver of the sound and less so or that was the thing that we really had to design for, but it has to do with what radius you are away from that sound. So the smaller building had a higher, acoustic requirement than the longer building just because of that proximity. So on that smaller building, the exterior wall is slightly different. That one, we did have to do the exterior wall out of, CMU to get um, that solid wall to address it, whereas the larger building was a different exterior wall construction and assembly just because of that proximity. But Windows had to have an OITC rating, the PTEX had to have a sound attenuation package, we had to have an acoustic engineer actually model, what sound was coming through with the entire combination of your solid wall, window, and PTAC to make sure that we were hitting certain standards.
I was really curious about that because I actually stayed in a hotel once in New York that was close to some train tracks, and um, I make sure that that's not the case if I'm coming there again because it was noisy, and I thought affordable housing. Did they cut corners there? It was just and I'm so glad to hear that that's exactly what you didn't do, because we all know we've in any city, tenements, we've heard about the tenements, places that aren't taken care of or aren't built well just because the people who live in them don't make as much money. Um, and I thought, who wants to live next to train tracks? I mean, convenience is great as far as, commuting to wherever you need to commute, but that noise would drive me insane. So I love that you really worked towards making sure that the people didn't have to experience that in any. It's New York. You're going to have New York noise. It doesn't matter where you go. But um, I really was just like, she's going to tell me. I want to hear that they did something acoustically.
Well, and I'll say that, uh, we would have wanted to do it anyway, but, when you're doing, affordable housing projects that you either on city-owned land or a portion of it was city-owned, or you're getting, your funding source is HPD or HDC, they wanna make sure that they're not, promoting developers who are cutting corners, and so they actually have all of this criteria as requirements. It wasn't optional to do acoustic calculations of the exterior wall. It's mandatory, and it should be mandatory. If we're really trying to provide quality housing for, every New Yorker, we have to make sure that, um, that proper due diligence is done and that proper research and analysis is done. And, the city really holds developers to, a pretty high standard, I think, to do that.
Well, kudos to the city. I really love to hear that, you know, that they're thinking about that for every level of population. Level's not the right word. All the different population types and their needs, and having the same standards.
That's right, all New Yorkers.
Yep,
Yeah.
New Yorkers.
Yep.
I'm pretty sure I was a New Yorker in a past life, to be perfectly honest. Um, Tell me a little bit about some of your choices for the materials and finishes inside the building.
So the inside of the building, a lot of the uh, cost is always a big issue, and maintenance is always a big issue. And I think that for a lot of projects, no matter what for a lot of developer projects, developers often have their palette of materials that they use, and that's just what they use. Because and especially for this developer who has multiple buildings, they're not trying to reinvent the wheel and have something different in every single building, because you want to make sure that, if you're managing those buildings once they become occupied, that you're not having different things, different materials that you have to maintain in all your different buildings. So I would say that the the actual materials that we had to choose from were fairly limited. So the apartments, it was going to be LVT flooring, and in the hallways, it was going to be VCT. And, those kinds of decisions, are more developer driven in terms of what they normally do. But in terms of how you put it together, the actual, um, color and finish that you pick for each one of those are the things where, we could come up with, figure out what the options are, and then try to find out what we should do, that's best for the interiors of the building. So for the apartments, we kept it pretty simple. Tried to use the flooring and the cabinetry and things like that that the developer normally uses, but tried to do a slightly lighter palette and keep it fairly neutral, kind of light grays, dark grays, very very neutral. So it's really the residents who are going to come in and kind of transform that apartment and kind of make it theirs. So I think uh, that was more the attitude. How do you make the apartments just something that is almost like a blank slate for a resident to be able to do? And then in the hallways, because especially in the long building, the hallways were so long, it was really using VCT and trying to find the right color and a kind of more interesting pattern to help break down the scale. But I would say that we didn't use exotic materials on the inside. It's just not necessarily appropriate for the budget that we were trying to hit.
And that totally makes sense. But color just alone is really a game changer on how a room feels when you walk in and what you're trying to achieve. The first thing when I moved into my townhome, the first thing I did is paint every wall on all 3 floors. Every wall. I have this almost black ceiling in my living room. Um, it was it what it looked like when I first bought it and moved in. It felt like a completely different home just after that one step. Completely different vibe, everything else. So I think it's an important thing to be, I mean, we all know colors are in architecture firms are always really paid attention to, but it can change the feel of whether something feels, I don't like the word cheap, but feels nicer just by the colors that you choose. Um,
Well, this building certainly is colorful. So
yeah. Oh, definitely. I like the way it's like a beacon to the neighborhood and to that stop on the subway with the colors that you did on the outside. I had never ever considered when I looked at the pictures that piece of the story. That just didn't occur to me just coming in and kind of watching those colors change. I'm home, this is
well,
my
and
place.
also and one of the things that we're trying to do is, it's not often that you get, as part of one project, 2 buildings that are across the street from each other, and so we really wanted to, emphasize this idea of gateway and welcoming you into, East New York. But also the building sizes were so different, the scale, you have this, small square building, and then you have this super long one, and how do you make it feel like it's a gateway and feel like it's one um, project, even though it's 2 buildings that kind of if you had um, different facades on them, you would never think that they were part of the same project because they're just so different in scale and size. But we kind of used that idea of the gradation so that as it lightened up towards the intersection and then wrapped its way up New Lots Avenue, that you could tell you know these um, this is one project and this is this gateway, and really trying to make the two feel like sister buildings.
I have to ask, and you talked about it a little bit in the beginning, but I think that reading your project description was the first time I ever saw the words architect led design build. I mean, obviously, I know what design build is. I've worked with it, but architect led design build. And I'm like, okay, what exactly does that mean? But I have interviewed some guests who have been both the designer and the builder on the project, a couple of them. Tell me how that worked on this project.
And so I think at the beginning, I talked about how our office, we're known for what we call ALDB, architect led design build, but we aren't the builders on some of our projects. And our office is, I would say relatively small for a design build firm. We're at about 35, and so we definitely have um, you know a certain size that's in our wheelhouse. And there are some projects that, are just too large for the capacity of our firm. And we our office is up in Harlem. We care about New York. We care about the urban fabric. We want to be able to participate in, designing buildings, homes, schools, all these, things in the city. And we don't want to not participate because we're not able to, build, a very large scale project. But I think for us and with a lot of the developers for these larger projects that we work with, one of the things I think they appreciate is because we have this design build as part of our DNA, we inherently understand that or care about cost, and we understand that there are design decisions that are made that can make or break a project. That, to do good design doesn't mean you have to do the most expensive detail. And I think we think strategically and we think about not just what the building, how the building is designed, but how it's going to get constructed. Because we understand that, I think we're able to be strategic in certain ways in order to uh, be able to meet budgets and try to get projects done and not, over detail something or not do something design wise that's inappropriate or is difficult to build or cost a lot of money to do a detail that in the end nobody's going to notice. Like there's probably 5 different ways to attack a detail, and some vary in construction costs in order to achieve that detail. So, in the case of this project, I think, the developer came to us because they read this article about the school that we had done, and it was done design build, and we were so focused on the budget, and they thought, "This sounds like a great pairing. I wanna do something interesting design-wise, but it's affordable housing, have to hit a certain budget. Let's try to use an architect who cares about that and understands that and doesn't see it as a limitation, but sees it as an opportunity." And so I think that's kind of where that background of our office came into play on this project.
What a valuable lens to have, whether you're building it or not, to be able to take that experience and that understanding from the projects you do build and also use it on the projects that you just design. Um, and because I do think we can do really amazing buildings and be very cost conscious and thoughtful about materials and make the choices where it really matters to maybe spend more in other places where maybe it doesn't, but it can still be amazing.
That's right. And
So
I think architects are amazing problem solvers. We're kinda trained to be that way, and if, architects actually had that experience being out in the construction site and, seeing every day how something gets put together, it just gives you more, ammunition on the next project that you do to be, um, more creative and to just, you have more tools in your toolbox in order to solve a problem. And, because architects are smart, they love to problem solve. They think three-dimensionally. They think, you know, um, in a very multifaceted way, but, all of us only know how much we know. And if we're exposed to, you know, uh, more information, we're just going to be able to absorb that and use it the next time that, we have something that we need to solve. So that's for us. That's the beauty about the architect-led design build. It hopefully we strongly believe that it makes, smarter designers.
well, you're preaching to the choir. I've worked in 4 different disciplines, one of them being construction, but also architecture, MEP engineering, and now building science. And I've always said when I'm mentoring younger professionals, the most valuable thing I ever did during my career was crossing the fence into other disciplines and seeing how the other half lives, how they work, how they make their decisions, why do they do this. It's been a game changer in my career and how I look at everything I do. So I love to hear what your firm is doing. I really do, because I'd like to believe that we should all be headed that direction and having that exposure. Because, like you said, you only know what you know. It doesn't mean that anybody's smarter than anybody else, but you have to learn it first, somehow.
And we're not experts in everything,
No,
and there are, people out on site for the different trades. They are the experts in the thing that they know. And so why wouldn't we want to learn from the experts in all these different things, you know?
absolutely.
Learn straight from the source.
I was really interested in this, and I'm going to kind of combine this next question into one. But so I know this building is LEED certified, but it also has, which this was new to me. I'm like, what is that? That was my first question. Has Enterprise Green Communities certification. So the combined question is, what sustainable features does this building have? Because obviously it has something because you have LEED certification. And what is this Enterprise Green Communities certification?
So Enterprise Green Communities actually has been around. I think it was created in, I think, 2004. And it was created by Enterprise Partnership, where and for them, it was about trying to have some sort of uh, sustainable criteria specifically for affordable housing. Because I think that, the goal was like, how can you try to be sustainable, but make it something that, individual homeowner all the way to a developer would be um, interested in doing and saying because it's something achievable. I think, for LEED certification, I think a lot of people, and especially LEED silver, LEED gold, it can feel a little intimidating. And so I think that EGC was originally created to say it's specifically for affordable housing. This is something that we know is doable, can be done affordably, can be done simply, and um, and and have developers who are doing affordable housing feel like, "Yeah, I can do that. I'm gonna do that." I think in New York City, if you are, doing a project through HPD and HTC, it's actually a requirement, whereas, LEED certification on this project was voluntary. Enterprise Green Communities is mandatory for all affordable housing that's being done here in New York City. And, it definitely easier to achieve than LEED Gold or LEED Silver. But, a lot of it is stuff that people across the country can do and understand. It's, something very simple: Energy Star appliances and products, if you can. You know, uh, Construction management waste. Um, a lot of the things that people are going to do anyway, low VOC or no VOC products. If you're thinking about specifying things, try to specify things that has recycled content in them. So, I mean, a lot of them are really basic things, but I would say actually in New York City, we have a little bit of a leg up because a, a lot of the projects that are done here, they are inherently sustainable because we're transit oriented. So in this project, because we're right across the street from the subway, we don't have, parking spaces for tenants, and most of the tenants in the building do not own cars because they rely on public transportation. That's huge sustainability wise. We're utilizing and transforming vacant land and creating density. I mean, creating 130 homes, and not just 130, one bedroom apartments. 50% of the units are twos and three bedrooms. Those are large apartments. And you're creating incredible density on these sites. So I think New York City, we benefit a little bit from just living in the city and being such a dense community that we're already kind of sustainable without having to try as hard as maybe some developments that are happening out in the suburbs or out in areas that don't quite have that level of density.
Before we get to our two closing questions, what can I expect to see down the road from GLUCK Plus? What are you working on now?
So we're fortunate in that we have a big mix of projects in the office. So we're continuing to do affordable housing, and a lot of them is for the same developer. We are finishing up construction, and we're not building it, but it's finishing up right now another affordable housing project in Brooklyn, this time in the Bed-Stuy neighborhood. And that one people should be moving into next month. which is really, really exciting. And then for the same developer, we just started design on an affordable housing project in Yonkers. But this one, we're really pushing it. We're going to try to do that one passive house. So I'm really excited about that. We're finishing up a couple of charter schools that, or actually, we finished them up. They moved in this fall, one in Queens and one that's in Washington Heights neighborhood of Manhattan. So for listeners, if they probably know Washington Heights mostly from Lin-Manuel Miranda's In the Heights musical. So we're excited about those two charter schools. We are doing, and one of those was design build, which is exciting for us. We're also doing some after school programs for called City Squash program in the Bronx. And so we're basically all over New York City, pretty much in all four of the boroughs. The only one that we're missing from, our office is Staten Island. We kind of haven't figured out how to get a project started in Staten Island. So anybody out there who has something in Staten Island, give us a call. Um, and then strangely, we're doing a lot of film studios, soundstage studios, ones that since, during the pandemic, everybody was watching Netflix and Apple TV, and there's just this thirst for content. So there's a lot of these people that need black box studios to basically build their sets and create content. So we're doing some film studios as well.
That's pretty cool. I interviewed a couple of times now an architect over here on the West Coast in California that designs film studios.
So I
A whole
think
different ball game.
it's a whole different ball game, and I think that maybe that architect that you interviewed, their client is East End Studios, and so
Mhm.
we are doing East End Studios here in Queens. That one's under construction.
It's karma. We were meant to find each other. That's
Right, and
that's
they
really
are amazing
interesting.
clients. They are great clients.
Well, I would love to have you back to hear about any of those. I'm obviously really excited about the one you're working towards passive house. So I would love to have you back when you get to a point that you want to chat about it.
I would
'Cause-
love to. That one we're just finishing up schematic design, so we have a ways to go, but I'm thrilled about that one.
Yeah.
And really looking forward to seeing how we do that affordably.
Well, I'm not going anywhere. So you can call me before that on one of the other
Okay,
ones as
excellent.
well.
Excellent.
So, two quick closing questions. I always close with a broad industry question, and my final question everybody gets. So, we talked quite a bit about this architect-led design build, and I am hearing from my not so much seeing it personally, but hearing from some of my interviews, more firms kind of stepping into that. Not there's not tons yet, but there are some stepping into doing more of that type of work. So, in your opinion, industry wide, do you think this will become the prominent method for doing our buildings in the future, kind of returning to the old master builder kind of model?
It's a good question. It's difficult to speculate. I will say with design build, there's a lot of different ways of doing it. So, I think some people have said that we're the most extreme example where it's architects doing both and it's the same people doing both. And I think right now, because of that, I think we're probably a little bit limited on size and not be able to expand to significantly larger projects until we, you know, grow the size of our firm. But I think their design build can be really effective primarily because it's like a partnership. Like it's a team of people that care about both the design and the build of that building. So but there's different ways that it can be set up. So I know that there are architecture firms that do it, but they have a distinct architecture arm and a distinct construction arm, and that's slightly different. You have a lot of design build that's done as a joint venture where, completely separate architecture firms and construction firms say, we're going to partner up and we're going to do this together and do a joint venture. Usually that's more contractor led than architect led. And, primarily because that's where most of the risk is, because a lot of those larger projects that can, where joint venturing, architect and CM happens, it's the CM is the one who's taking that risk in terms of, bonding capacity and, does construction at risk and things like that. But I I think that, um, in my mind, I feel like the projects that are most successful in general, not even talking about design build, are ones where, people want to be a team, that they communicate with each other, and that there's actually a relationship, um, with each other, a one that people like, and there's a sense of mutual respect. And I feel like design build, the premise of it is about that, basically saying there's a mutual interest, and we are going to work as a team, and we know that, um, you know, designing and building anything, it takes a long time and it's stressful. I mean, and it's tough. It's a difficult thing to do, but if you're doing it with, people where you're in it together and it's not about finger pointing, but you're in it together, it's just going to, um, it's going to make things better, and it's going to actually make it so that things get done in a way where, everybody feels good about it, and that, compromises are going to have to be made, but for the most part, nobody feels like they've been, beaten up and, tossed to the side. So with that idea of, teamwork and relationship, I think that's kind of what the core of design build really is. So if you say, do we think that that's going to be the predominant future? I don't know. It's a little bit of human nature, right? If we can predict human nature, but I feel like there is a lot of benefit to it, and people are recognizing it. Um, but it's um, I'm not sure if it's gonna be the predominant way that things are gonna get done until people really wanna start working as a team. So you tell me,
Yeah.
human nature, is that something that we all can embrace and do together? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd be
I don't
curious
either.
what the listeners think about
Yeah.
it.
You and me both. I think, the biggest concern obviously is having both people, both the architect and the contractor on board from day one. The biggest concern is always, well, I'm paying both those people all the way through. Or I could just be paying the architect to design and then bring the contractor on. But we seem to be a little short sighted in this business and not looking ahead to how much you're going to save on the back end on everything during construction, um, by paying that extra upfront. And we do that in a lot of areas. I hope that we move more towards that model of having that team, regardless of the delivery method. I really do, because I see the benefits. Once again, having exposure to the construction phase of projects, I see the ginormous benefits both to the client and to the project administration itself during construction by having that collaboration up front. So we'll see.
We'll see.
Final question, the easiest question of the day. That was sarcasm. Um, I tell people that and they're like, that's not an easy question. We all, I like to believe we all hope to live a life that leaves some kind of contribution to make the world a better place. Personal or professional, what do you hope your impact will be?
Um, in a strange way, I think, a little bit of my answer to the design build question is about relationships, and I do believe that, relationships are important, both personal and professional. And I feel, for me, I think, in the end, I want, um, anybody who, um, lives in, goes to school in, does business in, plays in something that I had a hand in designing with my team, that even though they don't know me, that they feel that they have a relationship with that space. because I do think that when we think about designing something, ultimately we want that space to somehow influence the way somebody feels and makes them feel good about what they're doing. So I think of that as relationships, and I hope that people feel that even though they don't know me. And then for the people that I work with and that I play with, I want them to feel like that there's a love and respect there. And it's again about relationships. So I think that's both work and personal.
My gut tells me you're doing a pretty good job of it. Stacie, thank you so much for joining me today. This chat was cram-packed with all kinds of great things I can't wait to share with our listeners. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today.
Thank you very much. And as these other projects progress, we'll be in touch.
Okay, definitely find me.
Okay, I will.